What did pain mean before prisons, before police, before the word torture even existed? In this story, we journey far back, to the towering temples of the Aztecs, where hearts were offered to the heavens, to the shadowy chambers of the Maya, where bloodletting unlocked divine visions, and to the courtrooms of Mesopotamia, where justice was written in clay and enforced with calculated pain. But this isn't about cruelty, it's about how ancient people organized their worlds, with pain as ritual, punishment, and even balance. To help you drift deeper into these distant civilizations, we've divided this journey into 3 gentle sections. First, the sacred violence of the Aztecs. Next, the ritual offerings of the Maya. And finally, the legal tortures of ancient Mesopotamia. So find a quiet place. Was the Iron Maiden ever actually used? And these are the forgotten tortures of ancient civilizations. Section 1. The Aztec ritual of heart extraction and the meaning of sacred pain. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, the city of shimmering canals and stone temples, pain was not merely endured, it was venerated. To modern eyes, the act of cutting open a living man's chest to offer his still-beating heart to the gods may seem unspeakably cruel, but in Aztec cosmology, it was something closer to a spiritual necessity. It was, in the words of one 16th-century Nahuatl poet, the singing of the blade, the flowering of blood. Pain and death were currencies with which one could repay cosmic debt. The Aztec practice of ritual heart extraction, known as tlacamictalizli, was neither a punishment nor a sadistic indulgence. It was a meticulously orchestrated offering, one that was both terrifying and beautiful in its choreography. To understand this forgotten form of torture, one must discard modern associations of cruelty for cruelty's sake, and instead consider the role of pain within a broader religious system. The victim, often a war captive or volunteer, was not executed in a back alley but upon the summit of a pyramid, in full view of the gods and the crowd. His screams were not a sign of suffering alone, they were a kind of cosmic resonance. The execution began with preparation. Victims were typically kept alive for days or weeks before the sacrifice, sometimes fed, clothed, and honored. This period wasn't meant to make them comfortable. It was to spiritually fatten them for the gods. Then came the procession. The sacrificial victim was paraded through the city, sometimes dressed as a deity, sometimes daubed in sacred pigments, and marched up the steps of the Templo Mayor. There, for priests would hold him down on a stone slab as the Tezcatlipoca priest, wielding an obsidian blade, not metal, opened the chest cavity in a precise motion. The heart was torn free and lifted to the sky before being placed in a ceremonial vessel. The body might be tossed down the pyramid stairs, or dismembered for ritual purposes. In some instances, bones were preserved and carved, a grim kind of scripture. But this wasn't the only form of bodily offering among the Aztecs. Another ritual, Tlacaxipualizli, or the flaying of men, occurred during the festival to honor the god Zyptotec, the flayed lord. Captives were forced to engage in mock duels against heavily armed warriors. These battles were not meant to be fair. They were part performance, part prelude to death. Once defeated, the captives were killed and then flayed, their skin worn by priests for days afterward. This flaying had a symbolic meaning that is surprisingly complex. Zyptotec, as a deity, represented agricultural renewal. Just as the husk must be stripped for the seed to grow, so must the human body be peeled to allow for cosmic regeneration. The priests wearing these bloody skins became avatars of this transformation. Grotesque yet sacred pain, again, was a key ingredient. It was not incidental. The gods had suffered to create the world, and so humans, in their reciprocal duty, must suffer to keep it turning. The act of offering pain was a performance of gratitude, penance, and metaphysical harmony. The notion that torture was always meant to extract information or cause psychological domination is, in this context, far too narrow. While the Spaniards recoiled in horror at these displays, they often misunderstood the philosophical underpinnings. The Florentine Codex, compiled by the missionary Bernardino de Sahagun, details these rituals with the kind of cool precision that belies their emotional weight. There are passages that describe how the flayed skins were kept moist with aromatic herbs and displayed like sacred banners. Children were sometimes included in these rites, an idea that deeply unsettled the Christian observers who wrote about them, but their role was not seen as passive victimhood. In some rituals, child sacrifice was believed to bring rain, especially if the child cried, since the tears symbolized the future downpour. Here again, pain was a tool of divine persuasion. But even within Aztec society, not all torture was ritual. Punishments existed for theft, adultery, or treason, and these too could be severe. Thieves might have their heads shaved and faces marked with ash, a symbolic death of social status. In more serious cases, they might be beaten with thorny cactus branches or subjected to burning coals. Yet, in these secular cases, the distinction between punishment and purification remained blurred. Did the people themselves suffer in silence? Was there resistance to these rituals? The historical record is both rich and silent on this matter. Accounts from Nawa scribes suggest reverence, not rebellion. But as with any society, the full range of individual experience is lost to time. Some may have wept, others may have gone smiling. Modern scholars have long debated the scale of these sacrificial practices. Was the number of victims exaggerated by Spanish chroniclers eager to portray the Aztecs as savages? Archaeological evidence supports large-scale sacrifice, but numbers in the tens of thousands, like the 80,000 reported by conquistador Andrés de Tapia for the inauguration of the Templo Mayor, are considered highly dubious. Still, the very existence of these events reveals something deeper, a civilization where physical pain was a spiritual instrument. The modern Western conception of torture, as a perversion and aberration, does not quite map onto the Aztec world. Here, pain had rhythm. It had music. It was part of the cosmic ledger, inscribed not in ink, but in blood. But what of their neighbors, the Mayans? If the Aztecs saw pain as performance, did the Maya see it as private devotion? Their own sacrificial rites suggest an entirely different interpretation of suffering. One far quieter, yet perhaps even more intense. Section 2. The silent suffering of the Mayans, bloodletting, kingship, and sacred pain. While the Aztecs made public spectacles of ritual pain, the Maya approached it with a hushed, almost meditative intensity. Here, in the stone-carved city-states scattered across the Yucatan Peninsula, the blade did not dance beneath the sun, but whispered in torchlight. Pain was not shouted from the temple top, but endured in the hush of ceremonial chambers. Among the Maya, sacrifice was often a deeply personal offering, especially when it came to blood point. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Mayan spirituality is the practice of auto-sacrifice, or siechab. This was the act of drawing one's own blood, usually from the tongue, ears, or genitals, as an offering to the gods or ancestors. It was not punishment, nor performance, but devotion. Both men and women of noble birth took part in this practice, though the highest responsibility fell upon kings and queens. The blood of royalty had spiritual weight. It could open the portal to the divine. In surviving Mayan inscriptions and codices, we see this pain described not as agony but as elevation. The famous lintel carvings from Yaxchilan depict Queen Lady Zak pulling a barbed rope through her tongue, a scene rendered with almost clinical detachment, and yet layered with symbolism. Her pain was not just hers. It belonged to the state, the cosmos. Through her blood, visions would come of gods, ancestors, and cosmic guidance. The process of bloodletting was methodical. The ritualist would sit calmly, breathing slowly, prepared for the sting. A stingray spine or sharpened obsidian would be used, sometimes dipped in chili or herbs. The blood would be collected on bark paper, then burned as incense, smoke rising like a bridge to the heavens. For the Maya, smoke was sacred. It made the invisible visible. To watch the smoke curl into the air was to witness prayer made physical. Unlike the Aztecs, who often sacrificed war captives in mass rituals, the Maya leaned toward symbolic sacrifice. However, this did not mean they were gentler. Captives were still sacrificed during major ceremonies, particularly in celebration of military victories, celestial events, or coronations. But the torture was more prolonged and psychologically complex. Inscriptions from sites like Bonampak and Piedras Negras describe captives being bound, displayed, humiliated, and eventually killed. The intent was to erode both body and dignity. One particularly grim practice was decapitation as divine imitation. The Maya believed in a decapitated maize god who sprouted from the underworld. Killing a captive by beheading wasn't merely execution, it was myth reenactment. In some accounts, the head was kept and used in ceremonial ballgames, symbolizing the eternal struggle between death and fertility. Another overlooked form of torture was starvation and exposure. Captives might be kept in ceremonial pits or cages, allowed to linger in liminal suffering. As their spiritual ripeness matured, they were sometimes painted blue, a color associated with sacrifice, and paraded in solemn silence before their deaths. Children, too, were not exempt. In the sacred cenotes of Chichen Itza, divers have uncovered the bones of young boys and girls, many of them showing signs of trauma before death. Whether these sacrifices were motivated by drought, war, or disease remains debated, but the underlying theme is the same: pain offered in the hope of cosmic favor. Even architecture itself bore witness to these torments. The ball courts, for instance, were not just sporting arenas but ritual spaces. There is evidence, still debated, that the losing team or even the winners could be sacrificed. The idea of playing to die is an evocative one. The ball game, in its deepest layers, represented the Maya underworld myth, where twins played against gods of death. To lose was to submit to the cosmos. But torture in Maya society was not solely for the gods. It also served to reinforce kingship. Rulers needed to show they could endure pain and command death. Inscriptions from Köppen depict King 18 Rabbit undergoing bloodletting before major rituals, binding his power to sacrifice. There was no crown without the cut. Yet, the most haunting aspect of Mayan torture may be its intimacy. The rituals took place in close quarters, often within palace sanctuaries or ceremonial caves. These were not grand spectacles but sacred murmurings. In such spaces, the flicker of a torch could reflect off a bead of blood on jade jewelry, and the cries, if any, were muffled by reverence. Unlike the Spaniards who later chronicled Aztec violence with revulsion, many early European observers missed or misunderstood Mayan practices entirely. The quiet nature of their pain rituals made them less visible, less legible to outsiders. In some ways, this invisibility has lasted to modern times, where the Maya are often portrayed more as mathematicians and astronomers than as people whose worldview was steeped in sacred suffering. But perhaps the real question isn't how much they tortured, but why pain remained central to their identity. Did they see in agony the echo of divine struggle? Was there comfort in repeating the sufferings of the gods? And if the Maya endured pain in silence, how did the earliest Mesopotamians, the scribes and city builders of Sumer, use torment not for religion, but for law? Section 3. Order through pain: the legal tortures of ancient Mesopotamia. Where the Aztecs sacrificed to appease gods and the Maya bled for cosmic visions, the people of ancient Mesopotamia, Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, turned to pain as a tool of law and order. Theirs was a society ruled by writing and ruled by rules. The gods might still be watching, yes, but so were the scribes, and those scribes had tablets. The first written laws in human history emerged not far from the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. Among the oldest and most famous was the Code of Hammurabi, etched around 1754 BCE in Babylon. It was a tall, black basalt stele, rising like a finger in the marketplace. At its top, Hammurabi himself receiving wisdom from the god Shamash. Below, over 280 laws, detailed with chilling clarity. Here, punishment was designed with a kind of bureaucratic poetry. If a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. The infamous eye for an eye wasn't metaphor, it was policy. This was not personal vengeance. This was the state stepping in to control violence by standardizing it. Torture wasn't chaos, it was calibrated. Mesopotamian torture, unlike the sacrificial rituals of Mesoamerica, was largely secular. It belonged to the courtroom, not the temple, and much of it was administered by civil officials, not priests. Torture was a method of investigation, of deterrence, of consequence. And it could be strangely creative. Take, for instance, the ordeal by river. If a person was accused of a crime and there was no evidence either way, they might be thrown into the Euphrates. If the gods favored them, they would survive, meaning someone would likely dive in and save them. If not, they drowned. But here's the twist. Surviving the ordeal could actually free the accused, while accusers found guilty of false charges might be sentenced themselves. In Mesopotamia, justice was a gamble, and torture was part of the game board. The punishment for theft was often cutting off a hand. Adultery could bring impalement or drowning. A builder whose house collapsed and killed the occupants might be executed, and if the victim was a noble's son, then the builder's own son might be killed in retaliation. Pain was tied to social status, to hierarchy, and to proportionality. But torture could also be psychological. One punishment for a lying witness or a negligent judge might involve public shaming, being paraded around with markings or symbols of guilt. In a society where honor was currency, this could hurt more than lashes. The Mesopotamians had elaborate prisons, early dungeons, really designed not just to contain but to break down. The House of Darkness, as some texts call it, was a place of isolation and exposure. Prisoners were sometimes kept in narrow clay enclosures with no light, kneeling in mud. Food might be withheld as a disciplinary measure. These weren't designed for rehabilitation. They were designed for compliance. Yet, there's evidence of mercy within this system as well. In some records, kings would offer amnesties, especially during festivals or after major victories. A ruler might pardon prisoners or reduce punishments to celebrate the favor of the gods. In this way, pain and pardon became political tools. You punished to show you could. You forgave to show you didn't have to. Interestingly, many Mesopotamian punishments were gendered. Women caught in adultery might be drowned, while the male partner might escape depending on his status. Slave women who struck a free person might have their ears cut off. Patriarchy was reinforced not just through culture but through corporal pain. And yet, there were exceptions. High priestesses, known as Entu, often held immense power, and harming one carried severe consequences. The Mesopotamians even regulated pain through economic lenses. Some laws included compensation in silver for bodily injuries. If you broke a man's bone, you might pay 10 shekels. If you struck a noble, you might pay 30. Justice could be bought, but only if you could afford the receipt. And perhaps most curiously, we find records of early medical texts describing how to treat the wounds inflicted by torture. Clay tablets from the city of Nippur list salves and balms for broken skin, fractured bones, even nerve pain. This suggests a strange dichotomy. The state broke the body and then employed scribes and healers to patch it up. Civilization, after all, is nothing if not the attempt to manage its own violence. In the end, Mesopotamian torture was about maintenance. Not spectacle, not spirituality, but structure. It served the city, the king, the code. It was impersonal yet intimate, cruel yet codified. And while the gods were invoked, it was the laws, hard-baked into clay, that delivered the pain. But what do we make of a world where pain became a spreadsheet of justice? Where even mercy could be mathematically rationed? And if torture was so central to maintaining order in Mesopotamia, how did later civilizations, particularly the Greeks and Romans, evolve these practices into new instruments of empire?